Hello, everyone. Welcome to Patients Out of Time, the Road to 30 podcast series. I'm your host, Mary Lynn Mathry. And this session, episode 3, we're going to be talking about the legendary Dr. Lester Grinspoon. He's been a big part of the movement. He's been more or less a mentor to me back in I think I first met him in the 1980s. After he was already a legend by that time. Anyway, today what we're going to do is talk with his son, Dr. Peter Grinspoon. And so as we get started, I'm going to introduce you to our moderator, Cheryl Murray Powell.
Thank you, Mary Lynn. Hello, everyone. Thank you to our returning audience. This is the Patients Out of Time Road to 30 podcast. We are at episode 3, and we have none other than the highly regarded physician, Dr. Peter Grinspoon. Those of you in the Massachusetts area, Boston, hey, we know that you really appreciate him being from your area. Even though he is based in Boston, he is known worldwide. Now, why are we doing this Road to 30 podcast? Well, Patient Out of Time is turning 30 this year. So it's all about how do we get to that 30th anniversary, really remembering those who've been important to our journey, important to our mission of educating patients and others who love patients. So with that said, we hope you enjoy the podcast. By all means, feel free to look at our past episodes. We have episodes 1 and 2 listed on our website. Please take them in. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in sponsoring one of our episodes, we have some really great speakers coming up. If you want to join us September 14th through 16th in Virginia for one of those Patients Out of Time conferences that you've been hearing so much about, we would love to have you. You become part of our memories when you join us in this education mission. And as always, if you'd like to donate to our cause, go to our website, patientsoutofTime.com. So with that said, I'll hand back to Mary Lynn. She's going to kick us off because guess what? We're all about multi-generational growth, multi-generational education. We're not stopping here. And the perfect example of what's possible if you continue your legacy is Dr. Peter Grinspoon, because his dad, Dr. Lester Grinspoon, paved the way so that he can be the phenomenal physician that we see before us today. Mary Lynn, take it from here.
All right. Well, I'm very, very happy today that we're able to talk with Peter Grinspoon. He, as I said, I've met Peter, but that was obviously as a physician. Didn't know the family back then. Back in the late 80s, when I was working with NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, for those of you who don't know, I served as director of the Council of Marijuana and Health, and that was my first encounter with Lester Grinspoon, because we would go to people such as him when we had questions. The whole purpose of that was to look at the research coming out, which always had those terrible stories about it, you're brain dead with cannabis, and the stepping stone theory, or now the gateway theory, and to look to him or others to see about, what is the truth of this research? Can you help us understand it? But anyway, want to start with the introduction to Peter. And what we want to start with Peter is to give us a history of his dad, Lester Grinspoon, who was at the time a professor at Harvard when he really got into the cannabis issue. But it was a personal journey for him to begin with. So Peter, if you want to take it away, it's all yours.
Sure. Well, my dad, Lester Grinspoon, he was a great guy, and he was very dedicated to the cause, not just of cannabis legalization and cannabis medicine, but also he was very interested in psychedelics. He wrote books about other drugs, amphetamines, cocaine, about drug control in the free world, about how drug users should be free to use drugs if they're not harming anybody. He was very interested in the anti-nuclear movement. He was just a very, very pro-social person. He was a psychiatrist, as you mentioned, at Harvard Medical School. And in the late 1960s, he started to become interested in cannabis. He was worried about it. He was thinking, what are these young people doing to themselves? How are they, the seems, at least everything he heard, was that it was very, very harmful. So he wanted to give it, sort of write a very comprehensive book about like, what are the harms of cannabis? Or, he was open-minded though. The thing about him is he had a lot of intellectual integrity. So he did an incredibly deep dive into cannabis, and he was worried about some of the harms. He was worried about its effects on teens, its effects on pregnant women. Some of the harms were psychosis. Some of the harms we're worried about today. But doing a deep dive, he came to the conclusion that like first of all, there was a vast social history of cannabis use among artists, among musicians, among writers. And second of all, there was a vast medical use for like thousands of years. And third of all, there was just a lot of lifestyle benefits that doctors are sort of forbidden to talk about. And he ended up coming out in 1961 in favor of legalizing marijuana. He thought it should be like alcohol, like a certain age limit that you could use it and so forth. He came out with his book, Marijuana Reconsidered, in 1971. This was actually really a bestseller. It was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review. And it was a very courageous book because at that point, only 12% of Americans were in favor of recreational legalization of cannabis. Now it's about 70%. So it actually went up about a point for each of the 50 years that my dad worked on it. This book catapulted him into being one of the leaders, as Mary Lynn alluded to, of the legalization movement. I believe he was on the board of NORML for a while. He might have even been the chair of the board for a while. He was interested in this for decades. And in 1993, well, first of all, Marijuana Reconsidered said, before we put all of our children in prison for marijuana, let's take an adult look at marijuana. That was sort of the theme of it. Then in 1993, he wrote a book, Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine, which I just reread recently. It's an excellent medicine. It had a lot of anecdotal evidence because, as many of us know, during the war on drugs, to have any money to research cannabis, you had to show some kind of harm. You had to show a drop in IQ, in motivation, in sperm count. You had to show something dropping to get funded by the government. None of that turned out to be true. So it was mostly based on anecdotal evidence. But this was in 1963, Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine. It really inspired thousands of not just patients, but I know so many doctors that are practicing cannabis medicine today that said that book is really what introduced them to the notion that cannabis actually is something that can really help people. And that sort of paved the way for legalization of medical, the first state in California in 1996. And again, my dad worked on it for 50 years. He was not well received at Harvard because he was very, very against sort of the social grain. He was sort of telling the truth about marijuana during the war on drugs when they're trying to create this moral panic about it. I mean, they couldn't wage a war on drugs without marijuana. There just weren't enough drug users. So they had to really fabricate and magnify the harms of marijuana. Though interestingly, in the Harvard Crimson, the Harvard student newspaper, in 2019, his book was called Marijuana Reconsidered. There was a editorial called Grinspoon Reconsidered about just taking task to Harvard for persecuting my dad, for being ahead of his time. And actually, in his case, being right about the war on drugs and about how we were like racially discriminating against, black and whites use cannabis at the same rate, but we were arresting blacks 4 times as often and so forth. My dad also, as I mentioned, wrote a book which is just really interesting, in 1979, called Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered, in which he called from the rooftops for the research into and the use in psychiatry of the psychedelic drugs. And that was why, as much as the cannabis stuff, they never promoted him to full professor. I mean, I'm not a big believer that academic promotion does anything. I think it's just a way to get doctors or academics to work harder for no more money. But in truth, they never promoted him to full professor, despite 180 scientific papers and 11 books, which is more than most people have. Interestingly, back then, 90% of psychiatrists were against using psychedelic drugs. And now the pendulum has swung, and now 90% of psychiatrists are in favor of using psychedelics in psychiatry. So my dad was literally about 40 years ahead of his time, not just on cannabis, but on psychedelics. So that is a long-winded introduction to who my dad, Dr. Lester Grinspoon, is. He passed away after a wonderful life at the age of 92 about 3 years ago.
Yeah. The Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine, I was just looking at it. And yeah, in that, I think he counted like 34 uses of it. So it was really opening up the world to it. And I think that's what always scared people. You think about a drug and they say, oh, it's good for nausea and vomiting. Hey, it's good for migraines. It's good. And when you start saying the third thing or something, they roll their eyes and they kind of think drugs don't do that. You can't be good for everything. But of course, as we later discovered,
right, that's what's it's so complicated, because the endocannabinoid system modulates so many things in our body. What keeps our body in homeostasis and balance, and it modulates memory, appetite, learning, everything. So it sounds too good to be true when you read about all the different things that cannabis can help people with. Of course, it doesn't help everybody, and some people have a bad reaction to it, but generally speaking, it helps millions of people with a lot of different things. And again, I agree with you. It sounds too good to be true, but if you understand the mechanism by which it works, it actually does make sense.
exactly. You go back in time then and go back to that personal history of when Lester literally because he was an academic, as you said, and he did the science, but that didn't mean he was a smoker. He wasn't a stoner back then.
Well,
Very
not until he became a stoner.
right. I'm saying back then. But back to your family history with his seriously personal use, family use.
Right. There's another chapter in my family history that I forgot to mention, which is that my brother Danny unfortunately succumbed to childhood leukemia. He had acute lymphocytic leukemia. Ironically, now this is a type of leukemia where like 99% of kids get cured. It's a very treatable cancer, but back then it wasn't. And my brother died after having the cancer for about 7 years. But for the last year of his life, my parents provided him with medical cannabis. They had to buy it illegally. My mom bought it on the playground of my brother's high school, and they let him smoke it. And it really vastly and dramatically improved his quality of life. Without the cannabis, with the chemotherapy, he'd be lying in his room alone, barfing into a bucket by the side of the bed. And then when he used cannabis, he could eat, he could hold down food, he could strum on this Fender Stratocaster, which was his favorite thing to do. And most importantly to us, he could play with his little twin brothers. So I, very early in life, started to associate the smell of cannabis with healing. Not to mention that my dad had a lot of like sort of members of the legalization movement and other academics around our living room, and they were always smoking and talking about these like deep issues. So I also be associated from a very early age with sort of as an intellectual and social lubricant. But it really impacted my parents. I mean, there's nothing more impactful than seeing the suffering of a loved one alleviated, and cannabis really helped my brother Danny. So that was one of the other influences that helped motivate my dad to work for the next half century towards legalization.
Yeah, and that was at the time you said you were what? You were just 8 years old.
Yeah, I was 8 years old.
And so you're a younger kid, not really knowing what was going on, except seeing the difference with your brother. That must have been, really. Yeah, I mean, from your perspective, how could cannabis be a bad thing if it was making him feel better?
Well, I think it sort of immunized me to a lot of the nonsense they teach you in medical school. I mean, it gets better every year in medical school. When I went there in the 1990s, they had to give a little bit of lip service to cannabis helping people with nausea and vomiting and chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. But, it was definitely included in the lecture of like drugs of abuse. And they had much more negative to say about it than positive to say about it. The psychiatrists and the addiction psychiatrists are getting better now, but for about 70 years there's very little difference between what the government was saying about cannabis and what the addiction people were saying about cannabis, which is really unfortunate, which is why to this day a lot of patients don't trust their doctors about cannabis, which I think is just very difficult and unfortunate. Makes life a lot harder for all of us. But I think that having this early exposure to cannabis, not just as a like social lubricant with my dad and all these like interesting academics, smoking it and sitting around the table, but even earlier with my brother smoking it and just doing a lot better. Nobody could argue that my brother didn't do a lot better after using cannabis. I think that sort of immunized me against the very negative message you get in medical school about cannabis.
I would think, how about the physicians? I never asked about that, but the physicians that were taking care of Danny.
They were very open-minded. It was at the Jimmy Fund building at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And they were very open-minded. They let him smoke it. They were interested. They started studying it. And it's interesting, even to this date, even today, 50 years later, what I've noticed, and I've studied this a lot. I read everything for a recent book I came out with called Seeing Through the Smoke. A cannabis expert untangles the truth about marijuana. I go through everything, sort of an update to my dad's book, Marijuana Reconsidered, in 1971. And what I found is that whatever a particular doctor thinks about cannabis, generally speaking, depends on his or her vantage point. On one end of the spectrum is the oncologist. They almost universally see their patients doing a lot better, like my brother Danny, gaining weight, handling the chemotherapy better, handling the pain better with fewer opiates. And something like 90% of oncologists are in favor of medical cannabis. Then on the other side of the spectrum is like the pediatric or adolescent psychiatrists or addiction psychiatrists who see the rare, very serious cases of like a young person, a 20-year-old, smokes a lot of cannabis, also drinks and whatever does psychedelics, becomes psychotic. And, there's a question to what role does cannabis contribute to that? So they tend to be very against it, and they tend to overgeneralize and think that cannabis does this to everybody. And I think most doctors are in between, and about 2/3 of primary care doctors at this point, it seems to grow every year, but are in favor of medical cannabis.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, you talked about your dad began his exploration looking at not just cannabis, but other drugs, some considered controlled and harmful. And that's when there was a certain point where he took a pivot and really drilled down into the cannabis side of things. Did you have any opportunity to discuss where his research was leading with regards to the other drugs and why cannabis got such a elevated position, not only in his research, but in his life?
Well, he was interested in all drugs of use and misuse and potential misuse and recreational use. His books are incredibly interesting, all of them. He's just a great writer. Like his book on cocaine is fascinating. His book on the speed culture is about amphetamines. It's just incredibly interesting about the social history. Drug Control in a Free Society that he wrote with Jake Bacalar is all about like, where did this notion that we're not allowed to use drugs if we're at home and not harming anybody come from? I know that Carl Hart talked a lot about the same concept in his recent book, Drug Use for Grownups, which is an absolutely excellent book. And as I mentioned before, he wrote not just one, but two books about psychedelics. He wrote Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered and Psychedelic Reflections. But I think the reasons he got so caught up with the cannabis issue is, number one, that so powerfully helped my brother Danny. I mean, again, that's incredibly impactful to see, the suffering of a loved one even transiently alleviated. But number two, just the social justice issue. My dad would, marching in the Civil Rights March, marching in the anti-nuclear, marching in the anti-Vietnam War marches. He was very pro-social, very politically motivated. And he just, like, all these nonviolent arrests and all this propaganda, he couldn't take it. He just really was dedicated. He knew it wasn't true because he wrote the book on it. And also he saw the experience with my brother. So I think the cannabis issue just called to him like for the entire second half of his life. And then the third thing is he tried it and found it really helpful for a whole variety of uses and reasons. I mean, he really felt like it gave him insight. It made him more thoughtful. It made him more reflective. It made him a better listener, and it made him just like a better person. So he was a big believer in its ability to heal, not just physically, but kind of mentally, emotionally, and spiritually as well. So the combination of those three things really, the cannabis issue was the issue. Very interested in the other issues. Again, very interested in like the anti-nuclear issue. He and Carl Sagan would be getting arrested at the Nevada test site, trying to stop above ground nuclear testing. Very interested in that. But the cannabis, if you had to pick one issue that defined my dad, it would be trying to legalize cannabis.
I love that. I went to kind of hear that understanding of how these different villainized drugs kind of came together in his research, but he really did so much to cause a catalyst with regards to thinking around cannabis. Now, those of us who are also parents and activists, you get to the point where your children are talking and they're actively involved. Did you feel for yourself, we'll start with you yourself as a child, you mentioned 8 years old, and your dad is doing this research. He's also a consumer. He's having philosophical conversations around the table, as mentioned, while smoking a spliff. Were you ever told you can't say this, you can't, be careful with this at school, especially with regards to your brother's consumption? But what was that like for you, dating back to your early days in, let's call them 60s, 70s, going to school and knowing that my parents are a little different, my dad's different than other parents? And were you given any disclaimers like, don't talk about this at school, they just don't get it, anything like that?
Well, we grew up in a very conservative sort of suburb, and alcohol was like the main drug. And, our house is like belching, cannabis smoke from the chimney. So we were definitely different than the other households. We were never given disclaimers. I think my dad just didn't care. He had a very thick skin and he believed in what he was doing. But I will say that it made for a lot of like cognitive dissonance because we'd go home, we'd see people using one of the demonized drugs, cannabis, and laughing and having these brilliant discussions, and like all kinds of academics and luminaries would be using it and sitting around. It was like there was nothing negative about it. It was like ranged from neutral to like profoundly positive and motivating. It was like you've never seen a more motivated kid from hearing these like spectacular conversations. Then you go to school and like every year the same three policemen would waddle in from Dunkin' Donuts and give us the same stale lecture on the DARE program about how like you take a couple puffs of cannabis and your legs fall off. And like I knew they were lying. And my twin brother too, we knew, and my older brother for that matter, we knew they just weren't telling the truth. But, there was no room to really say that or to express that. You go right to the principal's office. You get in so much trouble. So it was just very weird. I think that the main effect was, a lot of the kids sort of laughed at the DARE program. It wasn't taken that seriously, but I think it impacted me more than a lot of people because I had living proof that it was like complete nonsense. Not only was it wrong, it was actually the opposite of what was true. It was like the pure, like reading something in a George Orwell book. It was like,
It's misrepresentation.
Right, ignorance is bliss or what knowledge. So I think what it did is it really sort of undermined my respect for authority because these policemen would come in and just lie to us, and I'd be like, these idiots are lying to us, even when I was like 15. So I think that was the main consequence, was that it sort of undermined my, my sort of deep respect for authority figures because I knew that they could just sit there and lie to you.
Absolutely. So then you as a parent, unfortunately, not much has changed in these times, or until recently in these times. What was there any instructions for your children, or family members?
Having kids is very complicated because on the one hand, you don't want to participate in like the reefer madness, and like then they won't listen to you at all, and then they won't communicate with you openly about their drug use. I think communication is the most important thing. I think parents that have like this heavy thumb, their kids just go underground and they never have any idea what their kids are up to. At the same time, I do believe that kids, especially kids younger than 16, their brains are still developing, but ideally kids earlier than 18 shouldn't use tons of cannabis because it's not good for them. The mess, if they have autism and mostly CBD is helping them, or if they're like my brother Danny, they're dying of cancer, sure. But generally, and teenagers are wired to take risks and for novelty seeking. So of course they're going to experiment with it, but you don't freak out and they'll never tell you anything. They'll clam up. But, ideally you don't want your kids. So it's a delicate dance because you want to tell them, it is helpful. It's not Satan's lettuce, but at the same time, you don't want to use it until you're 18. Just say, wait. And that's a sort of a complicated, nuanced, and difficult message for, say, a 15-year-old to hear, especially if all their friends are using it. So, I don't think anybody has a perfect solution about the best way to talk to their kids about this. I'm always a big believer in openness and honesty.
Yes. Well, I have a 13-year-old, so we have
You
always had
understand
these conversations.
you're in the same
I understand. We've had this conversation over and over and over again, and fortunately, I feel like it. He got to the point that he was contemplating it, that he would come to me because he's seen all these other people come to his mom with regards to cannabis questions. There's no reason why he shouldn't. I wouldn't be judgmental, but I would want him to just say, wait, which I think is a great thing for us to kind of talk about, especially as we're approaching our convention. We'd love to see you there, and we can kind of expand on this just say wait topic. And I think it's something that people want to know. And those of us who are champions and activists, we also have to be aunties, uncles, and parents. Mary Lynn, I want to bring you into this conversation as the green sheep of your family. You do have loved ones and over multiple generations that may have gotten wind of what you do, or you've been loud and proud about what you do. How have you approached that over, the past 30 years, being an advocate, being an academic, a veteran, a nurse? How have you approached those conversations in family about what you do?
Well, to go personally, there's a family history of some alcohol problems in the family. And clearly I had nicotine addicts. I mean, we had the chain smoking both parents, smoking. I'd be the one going on trips with my head out the window, just wanting to breathe clean air. So those are issues. Getting into cannabis, my parents were a bit embarrassed about my use. And I wasn't a heavy user as a young kid or anything like that. But after, I used it recreationally. I used it with, peers who are all successful. We were fine. And then once learning about cannabis, and I mean the medical history of cannabis, it was like, I mean, I view it now that it's to an extent it's essential medicine. If you don't use cannabis as a medicine, you certainly can use it as a food. And I think that should be in every family just from the get-go. Hemp seed oil is just so wonderful, and we've demonized this plant, and yet it's so good for us. But no, I know we had patients at a time, or back when I was with Normal, and I had one of those cooler cups, the little koozie you put around your drinks in or whatever to keep it cold. And it was a Normal one, and I brought it home. And they're back in, I'm from Minnesota, North Dakota, and I bring it home. And a couple of years later, I went back and I saw that it was in this. We had one of those corner cupboards where you got the lazy Susan turns around, and it was like hidden way in the back. And we did our film, Marijuana is Medicine, in 1990 with the first 5 patients. And so I sent a copy, I gave a copy to my mom. What if, marijuana is medicine? I gave a copy to my parents, and I was home a year later or something and hadn't watched it yet. She didn't look it on. And her brother and sister, who both were from living in California in Oakland, and they were visiting. And I was like, "Oh, we can show it now." And you could tell she was just it was horror on her face, like, "Oh my goodness." But we all sat down and watched it. And my aunt
good for you.
having a great time watching it, and my mom's behind them, because she just didn't want, she wanted to watch them watch it.
But she wanted to watch it herself.
Did they ever evolve? Did they evolve in the issue, or did they stay against it their whole lives?
Oh, no. Yeah. My aunt and uncle thought great. And I think because they were in California, it was just a little bit more thought of, but they thought the video was great. It was impressive because it was featuring the first 5 patients in the IND program, and they, they could relate to it. So my mom felt more relieved. It wasn't until she was like late 80s and she had macular degeneration, and they were trying some of this some procedure on her eyes to see if it helped. And I brought her some cannabis tincture, and she was using some of that. And it was about 6 months later or something. And she said to me, "Mary Lynn, I think it's the only thing that helped." She said, "My eyes were," and she was wondering if it was what they were doing or not. She says, "But I ran out of it, and then the eyes started deteriorating." But it was funny. She, towards the end of life, she changed her tune. But yeah, she was embarrassed for a long time.
Well, that must have been a redemptive moment that you were able to, your life's work can contribute to providing relief to your mom, who wasn't a believer. I'm so glad you had that moment with her where you could be on the same page as far as there are benefits. This isn't about just getting high and going across the grain. So good for you. And since we last taped our episode 2, I got to visit you out on your farm. And those of you who've watched episode 2 remember something that I was spending a lot of time talking about was Mary Lynn's thesis, right? So you may be wondering, did we ever find it? Mary Lynn, do you want to give the update on your thesis?
Oh no, I found it. In fact,
We took pictures with it too.
Yeah. No, and I will be scanning it. It'll go on the website soon. That was back, Peter, that was in when I went back to grad school in 83 to 85. I did my thesis on marijuana disclosure to healthcare professionals going through normal. And of course, you can guess why, because it was the most used illicit substance. And I thought, hey, I don't think any of us are asking about it. And it was interesting. Most didn't ask. Were never asked about it. And at the same time, about half were afraid to admit to use because of the attitudes of the clinicians. Because I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's a shame when clinicians go to their healthcare professionals that they don't think they can be honest about their use. If there's a problem, we need to know about it. And whether it be cannabis hyperemesis syndrome that's coming out now, that is probably over diagnosed. I mean, but still it can happen. You need to know that all the facts about a person, what they're using. And of course, there's also dangers of just the contamination. I mean, there used to be PCP laced cannabis that went out. Remember way back, with the government's efforts, they were spraying it with paraquat.
Yeah, that was awful.
Yeah. So,
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about Harvard University and the School of Medicine. Let's give credit where credit is due. Dr. Grinspoon, what do you think Harvard University School of Medicine, what's their role in like really advancing the views and the credibility with regards to cannabis as medicine, as a second generation person in your family, with a physician in your family with a relationship with Harvard University?
Well, it's been evolving sort of as the societal winds change. They, as I mentioned, they were awful to my dad. I even have a letter where the head of psychiatry said, "Don't talk about marijuana in your office because we don't want it to seem like Harvard's in favor of marijuana," even though, of course, my dad could say whatever he wants in his office. It was absolutely ridiculous. Now, about 10 years ago, they got a big grant from someone named Broderick, who is made a lot of money in the cannabis industry, and they're doing a lot of cannabinoid research now at Harvard, which is interesting.
Phenomenal.
They aren't doing a lot of research on like clinical cannabis treatment. They just haven't. I've suggested several times they're just not interested in it, but they're doing a ton of stuff on psychedelics, which is really cool. It's really sort of ironic how the psychiatrists are like so much more on board with psychedelics than with cannabis. I wrote a lot about that in my book. Is it just, did cannabis pave the way for psychedelics, or is it like white drug, bad drug? Or is it, as my neighbor explained, he's a psychiatrist, very good guy, cannabis is thought by psychiatrists to be sort of like Valium. You have to keep taking it, whereas psychiatrists, psychedelics are this thing where they cure you of your depression. Why Harvard is so much more interested in psychedelics and cannabis. But I have to say, in my experience, no one's bothered me in 25 years. Even before it was legal, I've been advising people on medical cannabis, and they've let me, for example, the Cleveland Clinic, right? They're conservative and they're just ignorant, and they don't let any of their doctors in their entire network certify anybody for medical cannabis, even though medical cannabis is legal in Ohio. It just became legal recreationally, but it's legal. I mean, that's crazy. Or like the Veterans Administration Hospital, until recently, doctors weren't even allowed to discuss cannabis with their patients. Right. And like, try to find a veteran that doesn't think their cannabis is helping them with PTSD. So Harvard's really left me alone. And, they had me do grand rounds a couple of times. And I'd say they've been like, don't ask, don't tell, to like moderately positive in my experience. So given that my dad is so negative, I think they're definitely heading in the right direction. I mean, don't get me wrong. They're not flower children by any stretch of the imagination, but they're definitely heading in the right direction.
Well, I love that. And you were speaking earlier about, what is it? Why is it so much more embraced in the clinical community? The psychedelics, and you could actually raise a few good consideration as to why are psychedelics. I think it's one. I think there's a perception there's been more research with regards to psychedelics. Also, I think the dosing seems to be easier to accept of psychedelics, how it's dosed versus cannabis, how it's dosed. And then it may also be in addition to the ideas you mentioned, the smoking aspect of it, where psychedelics are in a more of a medical form, or can be easily transferred into a more what they consider medical form a lot of the times. Not all psychedelics, but I think those are the reasons I think it's been
I agree with all of the above. I mean, the irony is that cannabis is a psychedelic. So
and
anybody who's
true
taken a big
story.
dose of an edible can vouch for better or worse, cannabis is definitely a psychedelic. So, they have the typical psychedelics like LSD and DMT and psilocybin. Then they have the quote unquote atypical psychedelics like ketamine and MDMA and, you could argue ibogaine. And then, cannabis should be in the category of atypical psychedelics. It's really interesting that it's just in a different category. I think a lot of that has to do much more with the social history than with the science.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's almost like how back in the day in museums, you'd have like an Egyptian history room, and it'd be really completely separate from an African history room. It's like, hold on, Egypt is in Africa, that kind of thing. So I think we're just seeing that type of, again, misrepresentation or hiding the ball happening in our medical community. Mary Lynn, any thoughts from you with regards to this embrace that we're seeing for psychedelics that we haven't typically seen for the cannabis community and cannabis's treatment, I should say?
Yeah. What surprised me was in our, gosh, I might be wrong on the years, but it was a 2018 conference or something when we had it no, I'm going to take that back. It was 2010 conference in Rhode Island, and we were talking with Rick Doblin with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
Shout out to Rick
He
Doblin.
wanted to have Andy Weil talk, but he couldn't make it to both. They were having their conference on the West Coast. We were having ours on the East Coast. So Andy was going to join us virtually. We said, well, how about talking about cannabis to please both of us, And then he was saying like, well, that could be a little difficult because a lot of the folks in MAPS, this is Rick Doblin, a lot of the folks in MAPS are really leery about talking to cannabis because of all the baggage that goes with marijuana, they'd rather talk about psychedelics or hear stuff on psychedelics than cannabis. I mean, the talk worked out, whatever it was, but it was just, it blew my mind. I was thinking, what? But yeah. And I think, there's like a lot of people don't know, but in studying psychedelics, there's, even if they're Schedule one way to do it, but when you do cannabis, you got to go through NIDA first, in terms of who's growing the cannabis to get their cannabis to do the research, and it's this other.
Gotcha.
Everything's more difficult with cannabis.
That's a really good point that you brought up, the sourcing aspect that that burden that cannabis has that you don't have in the psychedelics world. That's another great reason. See, you guys.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's other issues. I mean, in addition to what I mentioned before about like the only way to get any kind of funding to do cannabis research was to show something negative about it. We've only done research on illegal cannabis, and when it's legal, there no pesticides, no fungus, no heavy metal, no lead. So number one, and number two, we've only done research on smoked cannabis, which is the least healthy way to take it. For example, in 2017, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, Medicine, and their report on cannabis. And again, they're not flower children either. They said that there might be low birth weight associated with pregnant women using cannabis, but that it was likely the smoking of cannabis because of the combustion products. So we haven't ever studied legal cannabis, and we haven't ever studied, edibles and tinctures and much healthier ways to consume it. The same thing with cardiac. There's some association of cannabis with acute coronary syndrome, but they really think it's the smoking, the combustion products, carbon monoxide, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. None of this we never studied like edibles and tinctures. And I can't wait till we have more neutral studies, not looking for harm, not looking for benefit, just saying, is this harmful or beneficial? What is the situation neutrally as scientists? We study legal cannabis and we study tinctures or edibles, which are much safer and where we can, to your point, control the dosing much more carefully. So.
Oh, yeah, I love that. I know Mount Sinai had, well, again, that was mostly CBD, but they've done some some studies on legal cannabis, but again, it was mostly CBD. In Jamaica, though, Dr. Henry Lowe, I want to just recognize him. He's a foremost researcher based in Jamaica, but he on the campus of University of the West Indies, he actually has a laboratory that's been studying cannabis for some time. There's a eye tincture he was involved with Dr. West, which was the first cannabis approved cannabis medicine for glaucoma. I believe it was for glaucoma, but eye-related issues. So there has been some of that type of legal cannabis research, but typically happens outside of the country, unfortunately. I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that was a good point, Peter, in that the last episode we did with Ethan Russo talking about our Missoula chronic use study, and at that point it was like, hey, let's look at this. Will be the first time we're looking at patients using cannabis from a known source and known dosage in terms of knowing what they use. But you're right, that was smoking it, and it was low dose, and it was dry and harsh. And of course, the biggest problem for them that came out of it was bronchitis, chronic bronchitis. You're right. We really need to be looking at, and products that used to be used way back when. They had the tinctures. They had these different, back in 1920s, 30s, et cetera. They had all these medicinal type products of cannabis that looked like medicine. And we should be doing studies like that.
Here in the state of New York, you can actually apply for a research license to do that type of research on legally sourced cannabis. So I think with this wave of legalization and research being an actual license type, we're going to start seeing more of that type of research. Also in Jamaica, when they legalized in 2015 and amended the Dangerous Drugs Act, they also had like a therapeutics license type, which lent towards doing research and also engaging with patients in a therapeutic way. So yeah, definitely the world has a lot of more examples for us to take a look at. But just the forethought of you, Mary Lynn, and some of these original advocates and pioneers, taking the time to do that legal research, even though it was something that was consumed by smoking, and also it was not the best quality federally sourced cannabis. It was just, you were at the forefront of research and legal cannabis. So thank you for that work with a few of your friends.
I just was realizing too, in my book, the old book, Cannabis in Medical Practice, back from 1997, Manly West did the chapter on
he did? Dr. West?
It's Canisol.
Canisol. That's exactly what it's called. It's called Canisol.
For glaucoma. And at the time I understood that actually he said that if he got a prescription or something, like they actually mailed some to patients in the United States.
Yes.
I got word about that to help. But yeah.
Yeah, that was the first legally approved cannabis medicine, the Canisol. Thank you for reminding me of the name of it, were those eye drops. Dr. West, may he rest in peace. And I've met, family members of his. And then Dr. Lowe is someone that I consider to be a mentor, and spent quite a bit of time at his Eden Gardens Hotel in Kingston, Jamaica, getting to know him. And where he resides in the States. I get to see him here because he's not far from my parents. But those individuals were super brave, along with Dr. Lester Grinspoon, to really say, if they make me a pariah, so what? I'm going to be at the forefront of this emerging, not only industry, but this emerging approach to health and wellness.
And that's a big problem, glaucoma, in terms of, I don't know, I think higher, in general, I think it might be higher in the Black population.
Right. But the one thing about glaucoma is that I think cannabis is most useful for things that we don't have good treatments for. Like a lot of things, like fibromyalgia. Like, what do we treat fibromyalgia with? Like antidepressants. They don't do anything, or opiates. I think cannabis is like astoundingly effective for that. Glaucoma is an example of a disease that we actually have really good medical treatments for. So I don't actually recommend cannabis for glaucoma because the ophthalmologists do a spectacular job. So, I think part of it, cannabis does help lower intraocular pressure. There's no question. But I think some of it depends on like how good we are at treating other conditions. If we have really, really good treatments, then we don't need cannabis as much. If nothing works but cannabis, then it's like an essential treatment.
I love that. That made me think of the word homeostasis when you said, you know what, cannabis is good for the things that people don't have anything else to treat. So let's talk about that word homeostasis. What does homeostasis look like and feel like to a patient? And how do you, as a physician, determine that someone is moving closer to better wellness, but getting closer to that homeostasis based on their use of this cannabis plant? Dr. Grinspoon?
Well, that's sort of a complicated question. Homeostasis is like the process of keeping our body within balance.
Yes.
So in the endocannabinoid system sort of regulates, is like an air traffic controller might, all the other neurotransmitter systems in the body. So if you need more excitation, it'll say, hey, give us more glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter. And hey, give us less GABA, which is a relaxing neurotransmitter. If we need to calm down, say our temperature is too high or our pulse is too fast, it'll say, hey, give us more of the GABA, the relaxing one, and less of the glutamate. So cannabis, well, the endocannabinoid system or natural cannabinoid system literally keeps every body system in homeostasis. Now, you could make the argument that cannabis does that too, but I more look at it like cannabis just helps alleviate symptoms, like oftentimes really effectively and even more effectively than traditional pharmaceuticals can. I mean, look at pain. What are you going to use for pain? Are you going to use opiates? Nobody wants to be on opiates. Non-steroidals, right? We lost 16,000 people last year from non-steroidals. Your Advil, your ibuprofen, your Motrin, your Naprosyn, your diclofenac, your Aleve, from heart attacks and kidney. I see so many patients with kidney failure from taking ibuprofen after ibuprofen. I mean, just because it's over the counter doesn't mean it's safe at all. And then, Tylenol doesn't really do anything for pain. We have some antidepressants that are like somewhat effective for pain. We have gabapentin, which makes you feel brain dead, and it's not even that effective. And then cannabis comes in and it really, really helps people. Not everybody, but it helps a ton of people. So, I mean, you could consider that in a sense homeostasis. If it's your body's out of balance because it's feeling this intolerable pain, and then cannabis, it not only does it dull your pain, but it makes the perception of pain less noxious. So you notice the pain, but it's sort of far off in the distance. So you can like get engaged in some activity which further distracts you from your pain. And then it helps with your anxiety about your pain. And it helps with your inflammation, and pain and inflammation are two sides of the same coin. And it can help your mood. I mean, pain and mood are two sides of the same coin. So cannabis helps in about 8 different ways, which makes it harder to do studies on it because, something like Advil, ibuprofen does one thing. So you could give ibuprofen or not give ibuprofen to see if something gets better. But cannabis helps in about 7 or 8 different ways at the same time. It makes it harder to study with the quote unquote gold standard, the randomized controlled trial, but it is really good at helping people alleviate symptoms. And it's good at helping alleviate when like the symptoms are all intertwined, like the pain, the anxiety, the inflammation, the mood, when it's all this big knot, like as I mentioned before, like fibromyalgia, like it's all linked together, and cannabis really helps with that. So in a sense, that's keeping you in homeostasis. If it's helping you get into these negative feedback loops and your mood's worsening your pain, which is worsening your anxiety, which is worsening your pain, it can help break these like negative cycles.
That's a good way to look at it. A question. So your dad went through learning about cannabis and doing all this without ever understanding at the time when he was writing the books and that, without really knowing about the endocannabinoid system. Did you learn any in med school about it, or did you learn about that on your own?
I read about it in the New York Times when they discovered like the first, receptor. Then they had a front page article, like the first anandamide was a big deal. So I definitely read about it. I was just in medical school from 1993 to 1997. So they had, in all fairness, they had just discovered like a year or two earlier. So there wasn't that much known about it. But the problem is, like, even today, they don't teach much about the endocannabinoid system. There was a study, it's about 15 years old, but they only mentioned or taught about the endocannabinoid system in about 13% of medical schools, which is absolutely crazy. I mean, I'm sure it's higher now, but it's still, everybody complains about how low it is. I mean, even if you think cannabis is like satanic lettuce and is causing the downfall of Western civilization, you have to know about the endocannabinoid system to explain why it's harmful. I mean, everybody needs to understand the endocannabinoid system. So I think it's just like astounding that they don't teach about the endocannabinoid system, and that like urgently needs to be corrected, because the pharmaceutical companies are interested in the endocannabinoid system. There's like a frenzy of drug development. I mean, it's really exciting, right? We're just using cannabis, which we've been using for 5,000 years, which like bluntly activates the endocannabinoid system. Imagine if they develop like designer cannabinoid drugs that can tickle just one part, make you more hungry, make you less hungry, make you less anxious, make you more energetic. It's really astounding what they're going to be able to develop. So it just blows my mind that they don't teach the endocannabinoid system like as one of the first things they start with in medical school.
Exactly. I mean, you say, I get it. You don't have, the curriculums are really full. Nursing schools, med schools, they're really full. It's hard to add something, but it's like 88, they found the receptors, 92, anandamide, and you're right. By the mid 90s, late 90s, we kind of knew this whole system, and it's 2025. It's how long is it going to take for them to get it? And that, I mean, yeah, to be a physician, you want to understand the human body as best you can, and to not know. To me, it's like this master regulator. To not understand that, you kind of
It's like not teaching the fight or flight mechanism or something like that. It's like this big gap. And younger doctors are really particularly bitter that they're not being taught more about medical marijuana. And it puts doctors in an awkward position of like not knowing how to talk to patients, not only not knowing how to advise them, but not knowing how to talk to them because they don't really know what's true. And then there's a whole group of doctors that are like, a lot of them tend to be addiction doctors who I love. I'm training to be certified in addiction medicine. Some of the, especially the younger ones are great. Some of the older ones are still very anti-cannabis. I've been shouted down at grand rounds when I've given like the most neutral talk about cannabis. But the younger doctors it just puts them in a very difficult situation because they don't really know what's true, what's not true, what's a myth, they've heard contradictory things, and they just don't really feel comfortable talking to patients. And that sets both the patients and the doctors up for failure. And I just think we could do a lot better.
Yeah. I've got an old Eli Lilly bottle, tincture of cannabis, 1915. And it said they used it for alcoholic DTs, and they used it in the treatment of chloral opium and morphine addiction. So they used it then. They were using it to help treat with substance abuse. As opposed
right. Well, that's the whole irony. The whole irony is that one of the big myths one of the big talking points of the war on drugs is that cannabis was a gateway onto addiction. You experiment with high school cannabis as a teen. Like I started at age 13, and within a matter of a couple of years, you're like strung out on heroin. And it was just total nonsense. It's just not true. But a lot of an increasing number of addiction specialists, there's still a lot of people that believe that, but some of the younger ones are now starting to believe that it's a gateway out of addiction. And I think cannabis can really help people with withdrawal symptoms from, when you're withdrawing from opiates. That's a huge driver to go back on the opiates. You have like muscle pain and stomach cramping and anxiety and jitteriness. Those are all the things that a little bit of cannabis can really help you with. And if you could treat the withdrawal symptoms, that could help transition people, for example, off of fentanyl onto something much safer like buprenorphine or Suboxone or methadone. And I think it really help. By the way, I think ketamine is also really interesting too. And I think we're going to have a lot of success using ketamine to get people off opiates. So I just think that there are these drugs that have been sort of tainted by the war on drugs that ironically can really help us with people suffering from addiction.
What are your thoughts on the entourage effect, whole plant medicine versus isolated compounds? What are your thoughts? It becomes a big debate in our community. But from a physician perspective, with your pharmaceutical background, clearly, but your understanding of this plant, all the richness in this plant, what say you on the entourage effect versus isolated compounds, or do we need to decide?
Well, first of all, it's interesting. My dad called it the ensemble effect, not the entourage effect, because he
Why didn't
thought
that stink? Oh, stick, I should say.
we're too THC focused. And it's true, we really fetishize high THC, and we should be providing cultivars for people with lower THC and higher CBC, CBN, THCV, whatever, CBD. We could do a lot better, both medicinally, I believe recreationally. If we lowered the THC, we just literally worship THC. So he called it the ensemble effect, but call it the entourage effect.
No, we're bringing back ensemble effect. It's the ensemble effect today. Yes.
It's hard to find a patient that thinks, for example, that dronabinol, pure synthetic THC, is as effective as whole plant cannabis. I mean, if you could find a patient that says that pure THC isolate is as effective, introduce them to me, because I'd be really happy to meet them. It's like nobody's clinical experience. I mean, the clinical experience of millions of people speaks to the entourage effect. I don't think we understand it that well. And there are all these like speculative theories like endocannabinoid deficiency, which sort of makes sense, but we don't actually know if they're true or not. But, they all sort of go back to the entourage effect and the fact that, we sort of co-evolved with this plant for thousands of years. And, every vertebrate has endocannabinoid system and it also goes to my point of like, think of how much we're going to be able to do in the future when we understand this stuff better. We've only understood the endocannabinoid system for 30 years, and the research has been very limited because of the war on drugs. Imagine what we're going to know in 20 years. It's going to be astounding. I mean, to the extent that the entourage effect is true, which, I think all of us believe, imagine how we're going to be able to fine tune that to get even better clinical outcomes. It's really pretty astounding to think about.
Awesome. A lot of celebrities, when they're asked what their favorite scent is, they say Rihanna, but that speaks to the beauty of essential oils and terpenoids and things like that. Are we missing something by not studying the effect of just the scent or the terpenoids in cannabis, and really understanding what part of the elevation experience is that? We all have the experience of walking down the street and then being like, and here, we hear, not here, we smell this cannabis terpenoid smell, and it engages us. It may make us be nostalgic. It may make us feel like, oh, we need to have some more. We need to try that. I want to get into a relaxed space. Is there sufficient research on just the terpenoid factor of the elevation we experience with cannabis?
We're just starting to research that. Is literally just beginning. As with all research with CBD, with CBN, with CBC, the minor cannabinoids, and with the terpenoids, the marketing claims soar so far above the actual scientific base. It's a little bit troubling. People claim everything and anything because the industry is like completely unregulated. And I think that does a huge harm to consumers. But the fact is that there's no reason to think these terpenoids or terpenes are not medically beneficial. And, we need to study to find out if they are, how we can use them best. And the most obvious example is like people do forest bathing and they just feel relaxed and their memories sharper and their thinking's very acute and they feel at peace. And that's just being in a pine forest. And that's just alpha pinene, which is one of the terpenes in cannabis. So, I mean, we know that terpenes can have a beneficial effect. The problem is there are hundreds of them and we haven't studied them that much. And I just think we're in the infancy in understanding how to best utilize them to further sort of health and wellness. So I think there's a lot there. You can't really listen to the marketing claims, and I'm looking forward to the research that we're going to be doing hopefully in the near term.
Awesome. And I know a lot of your work is around addiction and helping people to have a better life post addiction. Are we winning in this addiction battle?
No, we're not winning.
Are we winning?
Well, we're winning in the sense that
how do we get there?
Well, first of all, we have good treatments. We have Suboxone, buprenorphine, which is great. We have methadone. For alcohol, we have these injections of Vivitrol that help with cravings and help lower how rewarding the alcohol is. We don't really have good medications yet for like methamphetamine or cocaine. We're working on that. But I think the problem with addiction, in addition to the stigma, which is just going to take like decades to go down because the war on drugs didn't stigmatize just drug use. It stigmatized drug users and people who are addicted. In addition to the stigma, the fact is we have such a tattered social safety net. It's awful. I mean, and not even to mention the decades of like racial discrimination and enforcement and the people that are stuck with criminal records and the generational poverty that entailed. Not even mentioning any of that. I recently was speaking at a medical cannabis conference in Australia, and like Australia is a liberal democracy that has a social safety net. I also, a couple years ago, was in Finland. Like everybody has healthcare in Finland. Nobody's homeless in Finland. Nobody has medical bankruptcy in Finland. I mean, if someone's addicted, they actually treat people for it. But here we have these good treatments for opiate addiction, but studies show 15 to 20% of people who are addicted actually receive adequate treatment. Part of the problem is we have these fluffy treatments like rehab. Like all rehab does is keep you away from addiction for 90 days. And you repeat slogans from 100 years ago from Alcoholics Anonymous, and then you go back and you relapse. It doesn't do anything. But we have these really good medical-based treatments for addiction. But again, only 15 to 20% of people get them because people don't have health insurance, or the health insurance won't pay, or there aren't enough providers. Like, for example, in more than 50% of the counties in the United States, there's nobody that prescribes Suboxone, which is the best treatment for opiate addiction. People have to drive like 4 or 5 hours just to get their medicine for opiate addiction, or they're forced to go to these methadone clinics every day, which is so degrading. It's called just relapse because they don't want to be stuck on methadone their whole life. So we are not winning the war against addiction. And then with our recent president, who's cutting all research and all treatment and all health, he's cutting everything he can. We're going to go way back. We're just starting to see a drop in the overdose deaths. They just got under 100,000 a year, which is a huge number. I mean, everybody was so upset, rightfully, when in 9/11 we lost 3,000 Americans. We lose 100,000 a year to drug overdose, mostly to opiate overdose. This was just starting to go down, and now we're cutting Medicaid, we're cutting research, we're cutting social programs, and our frayed and tattered social safety net is getting a lot worse. So I think the overdose, we're going to be losing ground, unfortunately, and it's particularly painful because we have the tools to treat this. We're just not able to utilize them in a systemic and comprehensive manner.
Yeah, these are the types of conversations that you're only going to have at a Patients at a Time conference or in a Patients at a Time podcast. Just like Patients at a Time is the physician's favorite conference, we aspire to be the podcaster's favorite cannabis podcast. So really appreciate you for, going deeper and thinking about, what your philosophy is based on not only your profession, but your history, and then your own personal passions. And that's what it's all about. Mary Lynn, what are you hoping that our Patients at a Time conference in these political times will bring to our audiences?
Good question. The theme for the 16th National Clinical Conference on Cannabis Therapeutics is cannabis from prohibition to recognition. When we first went there, we were looking at the fact that the DEA was looking to move it to Schedule 3, which, as far as we're concerned, we think the whole plant should be descheduled. But moving it to Schedule 3 means to everyone out there, it's a medicine as opposed to it's the forbidden medicine. So, we just want to bring out the research and we always try to get, clinical issues with it because the patients' lives are changed. I think, Peter, you may know, I don't know if you know or not, but I'm so proud. The American Nurses Association, through the work of the American Cannabis Nurses Association, has recognized cannabis nursing as a specialty practice.
Right.
And so on the nursing side of it, we're up there. And I think a lot of it is because we see patients, and it's very frustrating in the hospital when you just keep giving a pill after a pill and this and that. And it's like nothing's helping. And then somebody comes in and they say they've got cannabis and they look so much better. They're eating or they're sleeping or they're walking. It's just amazing in that regard. So I think, that's the idea with our conference, is just the interdisciplinary and having the time for networking, for people sharing stories once they hear a little bit, because you want to check it out. So before we leave, Peter, if you want people to get a hold of you, how they should get a hold of you, but talk a little bit about, what you've got your book out, and stuff.
Sure.
People how can they learn more through you?
It's easy to get a hold to me. You just do my website, petergrinspoon.com. It goes right to my personal email, the contact me button. is Peter Grin. It's like grin like smile, spoon like fork. So it says petergrinspoon.com. My book, I just turned in the draft of another book about cannabis for seniors. Literally, nobody's written a book about cannabis for seniors, how to use it safely, what it can help with, kind of a how-to book. Also
So
talking
awesome.
about the harms and the social history. So I literally turned that in last week. Who knows what will come out? Probably in the fall or the winter. But my recent book from 2023 is cannabis. It's called Seeing Through the Smoke, a cannabis specialist untangles the truth about marijuana. And it goes through the whole social history, some of which we've touched on today. It talks about the harms. There are real harms to be worried about. And just like the prohibitionists or the addiction psychiatrists have to understand the benefits and utility, cannabis users have to understand the harms because we want to make an informed decision, right? No drug or medicine is perfectly safe. And with any drug or medicine, there's safer or less safe ways to use it. So I go over which of the harms are real and how to mitigate them, and which were the ones that were just like fever dreams of the war on drugs. I go over all the benefits, and then I have a fourth section called lifestyle uses, about how it helps people with like appreciate sex and music and art and the outdoors and each other. And it's just got such a fascinating topic. It just like goes on and on and on. So again, that's called Seeing Through the Smoke. And I let's try to find a way for me to come in September. I don't think I can because this book is going to be coming out, and I'm also taking my addiction boards in October. So I'm going to be pretty busy. But if we get find a way, because it sounds like a spectacular conference. It really just sounds wonderful.
And it would be great to have, we always have Michael Green there, book sale. We would love to have your book there, and people love to get autographed copies.
All right, so we'll try to find a way. I have to scrounge up some extra days off. My job as a primary care doctor is pretty rigid with the days off, so we'll have to see what we can do.
Yeah, patients need you, and it's nice to have physicians who listen to them. That's such a basic thing, is listening to the patient, and I think that's always been my frustration with the medical side that is so, I don't want to hear about it,
Well, it gets harder every year, to be honest, even if you're a really nice doctor who cares about the patients. You less time, more patients, more red tape, more things we have to be worried about, more things the patients are worried about because they never get to see you. It gets harder and harder every year. So I know some really, really good doctors that are really limping through. It's something's got to be done. It's pretty tough for doctors these days.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for your books, especially acknowledging the senior community. It is so essential. My best friend in Ross Park community is a 78-year-old
They're the fastest growing demographic using cannabis.
They are the fastest demographic. Yes. And even when you go to the dispensaries, you see so many seniors there. And I was going to tell you that my best friend in the Ross Park community is a 78-year-old woman. She actually spoke on a women in weed panel today, been consuming as well as distributing for faith-based purposes cannabis for over 50 years. And those are the people that we don't hear their stories, but we don't prepare for what is new cannabis all about. So we really need to take in your book. You said it'll come out later on this year. We'll keep our audience posted on that launch, and we'll definitely make a big deal about it at the conference, which we'll hope you'll be attending along with us. This is really important work, and thank you.
I said in my book that no matter how old you are, there's no guarantee you're going to be the oldest person in the dispensary. So.
No, there's quite a range that you see in the dispensary and in our ciphers, in our circle, and how we consume as a culture. You'll see all of the ages represented. So really, really appreciate that work, and looking forward to seeing you at the conference. I got an opportunity maybe 2 weeks ago to go see Cheech and Chong's last movie.
I saw that. That was a great movie.
Isn't
that was
it
actually
phenomenal?
Really good. I thought
I loved it.
It so exceeded expectations. I mean, it like vastly exceeded. It was actually a very deep movie.
It was a very deep movie. It was their love story of each other and each other's talent, but a love story of their relationship with the plant and how the plant kind of catapulted their individual and collective careers. And I got to go to a premiere where Cheech and Chong were present, and they gave the introduction. So, highly recommend. If you're looking for a movie to check out Cheech and Chong's last movie. And again, hat off to our seniors who have been consuming for all these years. They understand. They took the risk early on, and then as far as how society views the plant, but they also changed how society views the plant. And to know that there's never been a book that acknowledges that there's a certain demographic that has not only been some of them are just being introduced to cannabis and they have all these ailments, but some of them have been using cannabis for many decades. What a great area of research, as well as what a great area of new discovery for this community. So please keep us posted on the feedback of your book. So as we mentioned earlier on in our podcast, the Patients Out of Time Conference is September 14th through 16th in Virginia. You can register on our website. In addition to that, we are looking for people who want to attend, but people who want to sponsor that conference. So please check in with us if you'd like to be one of our sponsors. We are curating the most higher level education experience for our attendees. If you are interested in speaking, please let that be known as well. There's always a place for people. We have great dining experiences where our sponsors would be able to share whether it's their product, their services, or just their experience, so we can come together as a community. So really excited about September. Look, really excited about seeing you in person, because I believe that we will be able to make that happen, Dr. Grinspoon. And again, to our fearless leader, Mary Lynn Mathry, nurse, veteran, visionary, podcaster, executive producer, and farmer. We love you. Thank you for your vision that keeps this whole thing running. That is the reason why people actually have physicians willing to take the risk, willing to incorporate cannabis as an option when we're talking about healthcare and wellness. Thank you, Mary Lynn. I'd love to give you the final word.
As a final word, I hope people do enjoy this podcast. And our mission has been to educate, because as Peter's learned through school, we've been taught exact opposite of what this plant has to offer. And I look at this plant as it's just, somebody said it's such a forgiving plant. You might not have the right thing. You can mess up on the dose and that, but it's not going to cause great harm in terms of that. And I certainly agree with what Peter said. We want to educate because there are bad ways to use it. And some people maybe shouldn't use it. But for the most part, it can help in so many ways. And I think many times it is a last, nothing else is helping someone, and they try cannabis and their life changes. And it's just magnificent. But the big thing is to help people understand how to use it. I've said this before. I've seen it in Charlottesville, Virginia. They're selling some cannabis that's 500 milligrams of THC in one candy bar. 10 squares, 50 milligrams a square. That is outrageous. Nobody should be taking something like that. And the fear of, having some older person come in and take that. Oh my God. That's absolutely.
That's a bad night.
And so they need guidelines, and people look to healthcare professionals. And that's, to an extent, the reason we started Patients Out of Time was wanting the public to know, but primarily get healthcare professionals so that they can guide patients about safe and appropriate use. So thanks for listening, folks, and tune in to the series.